If I had known he was going to list all that, I would have invited my mother to this talk. Okay, so in order to talk about the future, I think it's important that we go back to the past, and the only way to see the future is to see what predictions have turned out to be true, what haven't, and look for patterns. And I'm going to start with my own past. This is my origin story. So this is how I came to this. And so you're going to understand as I talk about things, maybe a little bit why I think about things the way I do. So my introduction to virtual reality happened when I was about 6 years old, and I started playing with little plastic dinosaurs. How many people here have played with little plastic dinosaurs ever? Okay, so you know what I mean. When you're 6, those dinosaurs are real. You know, that you grab that Brontosaurus and that Triceratops and you start taking them on adventures and, you know, mysteries and romances. And it's all very vivid. And then you look back later with your adult mind and you realize, how did I do that? And I think it's because little children have this ability to turn everything into stories, which are incredibly vivid. And I suspect a lot of what we do as grown-ups is, a lot of the work we do is actually trying to get back to this ability to just freely invent that we had as children. And in some sense, you could argue that all of the things we're doing with our adult mind are kind of a prosthetic to put back what we've lost when our minds were able to roam freely when we were 5, 6, 7 years old. And so other influences, there's a book, came out in 1951 in the United States called Harold and the Purple Crayon that I think all children in the US read when they were little. And the idea is very simple. There's a boy named Harold. He has a purple crayon and he can draw anything he wants with it. And whatever he draws just comes to life and becomes real. And when you're a child, that makes perfect sense. And so I thought, you know, thinking back, this was an important influence. Of course, I saw Fantasia, like all children in the US saw it, and probably many around the world. And again, this idea of Mickey Mouse being able to conjure things in the universe. And then it turns out they had dinosaurs in Fantasia, so that comes full circle. And then as I got a little older and I started going into the world, I started working on computer graphics, because I think in some sense working on computer graphics was my answer to having seen Fantasia. I said, I want to do that, but because I was doing that in a later time, I started doing that with computers. I worked on Tron, the good one. And then I started developing these techniques to move beyond that. And this was drawing from these things that I had seen in, you know, the great Disney animators were creating this beautiful art and this illusion of life and this illusion of nature. And so I started developing procedural texture techniques so that people with computers could also think like artists and conjure things with nature. And not have to just think in terms of the physics, but think in terms of visually, how would I design something as an artist? And so I started creating these things, and then these things started getting used in movies. And then, in fact, I think one movie was Jurassic World, and so now my techniques are making dinosaurs. Yay. Yay, Ken. And so then I just kept thinking beyond that, what constitutes how we as artists can use these ever-changing tools to create possible futures. And I think the ever-changing is important, and I'm going to circle back on that. At some point, I founded this lab, and we had lots and lots of discussions about what to call it, and we decided not to call it the virtual reality lab or the augmented reality lab or the mixed reality lab or the enhanced reality lab or any of those. We decided, well, what we really want is to talk about things that are going to be so normal that they won't even be considered the future anymore. So what will be the everyday future that people will take for granted? There are things we take for granted now. We don't even think of them as technology. Printing, the web. Little kids couldn't imagine a life without one of these things, you know, glued to their bodies at all times. And so things that we stop thinking of as technology we stop thinking of them as technology because they've become integrated into culture. They've become integrated into our everyday communication with each other. Probably the most, one of the most fundamental technologies that changed all of humanity in a very profound way is now so integrated into the fabric of our lives that we don't even realize it's a technology. And in fact, it is illegal not to have it. And that's clothing. Clothing, it's like if you show up here without clothing, they probably will arrest you and then lock you up because you're crazy. And yet it's a technology, it's not natural. So we have to be careful that we remember, and that's why we call it the Future Reality Lab, not the technology blah, blah, blah lab, that a really successful technology makes itself invisible and just becomes part of reality for us. And this is a profound quality of humans as tool makers. This is what we do. We create things, and then we created this building, these lights, plumbing, electricity, and then we just call it reality. So we've done a number of projects where we put multiple people in experiences together, and we say, oh, why don't we just see how they interact when we give them whatever tools we could. We were doing this in 2014, 2015, where we would throw people into virtual reality in the same room, and we would change the reality and see, hey, what would happen if we changed reality like this? And I guess I could show you one of those. I don't want to spend too much time on that. So this was something this was a version of this that we showed in, I guess, 2016. We had started showing it in 2014. I don't know, may have to adjust the audio levels. We'll see how this goes. That's good. So this was something we showed in Stuttgart, where everybody is wearing these VR headsets and has these controllers, but they see each other in their actual locations in the room as avatars of themselves, as carefully non-gender determined versions of themselves. And so they just play games. We let them do whatever they want. They draw in the air, they create things, they make art. And what was really important about this, more than anything else, was the fact that people didn't see each other as some sort of creature. They saw them as their friend. My friend is now wearing a digital costume, and we have jumped into this alternate world together where we have all these powers, which really affirms the fact that the most important thing is the social connection between people. And just letting people use their own imagination and their own creativity in order to share whatever tools you give them. Because the most powerful thing you have is the imagination of the people who are using those tools. So if this time, I'll show you some more projects. But I think what we then started thinking is, in some sense, you could say the holodeck, the idea of the Star Trek holodeck where we all beam into another world. The most important thing about this concept of a holodeck that has been echoing for the last 30-something years since it showed up on Star Trek in 1987 is the fact that it involves other people. It's fundamentally a social experience, and that's because this is what we are. Our brains, by evolution, are wired to be social. So we took this to an extreme at this last SIGGRAPH conference in Vancouver last summer, where we created a holographic movie by giving everybody a virtual reality headset and having them all see the same movie together in the same room, and they're all transported into another world. And we had 30 people at a time, so we had 2,000 people in the course of 3 days all experience having seen it was like a magical theater piece in another universe. And the most interesting thing about that was that putting people in this alternate world, in this audience together, created these powerful social connections between the audience members. They weren't isolated, they were together. So I can show you, this is just a short view of what happened there. So this is the Vancouver Convention Center. And all of these things that I'm showing you are just kind of to give you a little bit of orientation for talking about what might be possible in the future. So each of the people who stand online here are going to go in together as an audience, which is really nice, because usually in virtual reality you have these long lines and one person gets to do it at a time and everybody else is like getting really upset. And here everybody sort of gets to go in together. And they're all seeing each other in the other world as versions of themselves. The story we told was kind of we thought of as the origin story for virtual reality. Basically, it takes place in a cave, and it's about cave paintings 12,000 years ago. And magical things happen, things come to life. But to us, the most exciting thing was that people experienced this as a social phenomenon. And then many people just kept coming back and seeing it from 4 different seats, like you would with some theater that you really like. And this whole experience of watching people in these social experiences bonding with each other really helped to convince our entire research team that what we need to be doing is creating connections between people. And if you want to come to New York, we can show it to you. Okay. All right, so now, here's the current state of virtual reality for most people. If you go into VR, you wear in this case an HTC Vive, or you have an Oculus Rift, and there's one person in a room. Now, you could have another person in another room and have them virtually connected, but it's a very, very sort of not social experience by default, because I think it was focused on, as a marketing push, it was focused on gamers who just want to go into an online experience with other gamers. And so in some sense, this reminds me of the origin of cinema. This was how cinema began, with the kinetoscope, where you had these parlors of people who were all standing next to each other, ignoring each other, not having a shared experience. They weren't even seeing the same moment of the film at the same time. They were each in their own personal world. And the real change in cinema, the moment when it started having a profound cultural effect, was around 1895 with the introduction on a large scale of the projector. And now this is very profound because these people, yes, they're there to see a movie, but they're really there to hang out with each other. Just like when you go to a restaurant, when you go to the park, when you go to a museum, when you go to any experience, a bar, a sports game, you're there to be with your friend, and you're learning about the person you're with. And in some sense, the movie you're seeing is almost an excuse to have a bonding experience with your friend. Most of you don't usually, well, I'm curious, how many people usually just go out to a movie theater by themselves? How many people usually go out to a movie theater with somebody else? Okay, I just informally, I think the latter is probably a few more than the former. So this comes down to, I think, that we are creatures who evolved, we biologically evolved as a species to be in the presence of each other and to respond in a powerful, visceral level to the presence of other people. So everything that you do that thinks about the future, there are some things about this that are connecting, and there are some things that are isolating, and the things that are isolating, I think, are going to be a dead end. They're going to fade away, just as all technological innovations end up having some things that work and some things that, so sound recording continues. We believe in sound recording and songs and having songs to millions of people, but specific technologies for cartridge tapes and things, they go away. Certain things end up just going by the wayside. They're stepping stones along the way. So I think what's going to happen as technology allows it is that all the things that allow us to get back to this, to people being around a campfire, telling stories, being with other people, as the technology lets us do that more, that's what's going to happen. Because we are not evolving biologically. We're only evolving technologically. We biologically, a baby born now is not that different from a baby born 190,000 years ago. So it's the beginning of our modern species. All of our evolution is happening through our development of tools, and how the same exact biological brain and body that we've had for all this time responds to that ever-changing landscape. So in 2006, I read this book. I'm curious, how many people read this book? Very few. This is a very important book. It's a novel. Vernor Vinge is a wonderful science fiction writer, and he basically says it's about 40 years in the future, and 40 years in the future, everybody wakes up in the morning and they pop in their contact lenses, and now they can see whatever they want. Now, this is really different from, for example, Ernest Cline's Ready Player One, where everybody's in a little pod, you know, and just pretending to share a world. Vernor Vinge's conception of the future is we're in our bodies, we're in the physical world, we're walking around, we see things. It's just that we can see an overlay on the world of whatever is useful for us to see. So it's about face-to-face embodied social communication with facial expressions, with hands and feet, not trying to recreate those things, but trying to say enrich them. Which in some sense is in line with most of what's happened with most of technology. You know, you wear clothing on your real body, and then that creates a modification of your social interaction with people. I think that questions to ask at this point are, what happens when this kind of conjectural thing starts coming into the real world? What happens if, you know, I can start just saying, hey, I want some kind of technology, I can envision it, I can draw it on the drawing board, and then it becomes part of my world. You know, here's my future glasses. And, you know, they've got these tiny little projectors, they've got some CPU and GPU and communication and some light pipe that, you know, and everything I can see is in stereo and 3D and stuff's floating in the air. How are people going to respond? How is this going to affect society? I actually think the engineering of how to do this is the least important part. The most important part is what is the profound effect it's going to have. And Gordon Moore in 1965 famously predicted that computers would keep increasing one way or another in power at an exponential rate. And so far, that's been pretty true. Sometimes it's CPU, sometimes we invent GPUs, sometimes it's communication, sometimes it's power storage, sometimes it's compression technologies, but there's always something that's moving forward and bringing us up at a roughly exponential rate as the years go on. And we tend to forget how profoundly that this has changed us. In 1992, there was no web. There was an internet, but there was no web. There was no browser. 1993 is when Mosaic came out, quickly followed by, you know, there was Netscape, and then there was Explorer, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the entire infrastructure that we think of as the modern world of communication, that whole thing only started in the last quarter of a century. And in 1992, if you were talking to someone and you started describing ideas of, say, Wikipedia, people would have probably thought you were crazy. Like an encyclopedia, and just anybody just writes whatever they want and it works. But Wikipedia is pretty much what people go to now when they want some reasonable first approximation. And not only that, but also they want references to then more learned texts. They hop to the references. And this whole structure was inconceivable. People would have not believed you if you'd said it. And if people said, oh, the way to make money is to just create something like Google. You couldn't even have explained Google to people in 1992 because there was no web, so there was nothing to index. And the only reason there became something to index was that the profound change in the web was that what happened was that instead of having to go to a publisher to put your thoughts out to everyone in the world, anybody could self-publish. So this idea of self-publishing to potentially 7 billion people, that pretty much started a quarter of a century ago. And then there was another profound change, again going up Moore's law, which happened around the middle or end of 2007 when Apple, namely, came out with the first successful smartphone. Others had tried before. The Windows Phone was 2005, but people hadn't quite gotten it right. And then suddenly, when somebody got the smartphone right, then suddenly that entire world of information that everybody publishes and all the services, suddenly, you know, in the last decade or so, the last 11 or 12 years, they're in your pocket. They're wherever you want to go. And there were concepts that were inconceivable before you had that. Yes, in 1966, Captain Kirk has his communicator, and everyone says that's going to happen in 300 years. But that's different from everybody actually has it. So for example, the business model for something like Uber or Lyft, The idea that I can be standing anywhere and I can call a car and I don't even have to know where I am. And maybe I had so much to drink that I lost my wallet. I'm not even gonna have to pay, it doesn't matter, I have my smartphone. And I call them, and the driver has no idea where I'm going and has no idea how to get there. And I don't even have to pay them at the end. And it all works. And it all works because we're all carrying these powerful edge computing devices that are talking to the cloud, and there are services that are making it possible for all these things to happen. Now, we can debate what's good and what's bad about things like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and Instagram and all these things, but what we have to acknowledge is that they've had a profound change on how we deal with space and time, and just the fact that you have Google Maps and route finding wherever you are, and many, many other examples. So let's talk about some things that don't change. Some things that don't change, as far as I know, are the laws of physics. So if I have a big honking PC, you know, big tower, I can plug that into the wall, and that means I can draw between 300 and 500 watts of power. That's just the way that works. If I've got something that has to be very lightweight on my head, no matter how advanced my technology is, I can draw 3, maybe 4 or 5 watts, but that's it. You don't, there's no you know, magic Iron Man's power source in real life. I'm sorry to disappoint Marvel fans. And so if you look at Moore's law, which says that computation doubles in power roughly every 1.5 years, and then you think about this factor of 100 of power, which is imposed by the laws of physics, that means there's basically a 10-year gap in computation between the thing that is in your office plugged into the wall and any wearable device that you'll have, even if that's connected to the phone in your pocket, because this is still only drawing a few watts of power. So if you think of what your wearable in the future as being your personal portable ecosystem, that's not going to be able to be the same as this other thing, which means you have to create what I call double-edge computing. Basically, we have this edge computer now, and you experience the edge computer all the time. You know, if I do speech to text into my phone, and then it sort of does a rough approximation, and a few seconds later, it fixes it up, and it's like, oh, now it's all spelled correctly and everything. That's because the local app did the best guess it could using its little processor and limited database capability that's in here, and it said, okay, well, this is sort of what you meant. Then it sends it out to the cloud, and a very large bank of computers are using machine learning and a lot of data to say, no, this is what you really said, send it back, and then it fixes it up. So that's edge computing. I'm sitting here on the edge of some very powerful network, but one of the problems is that that works for this, but that doesn't work for something you wear on your head. Because something you wear on your face, it's not good enough to start getting a response in a few seconds. Some things you have to get in a second. Some things you have to get in 1/10 of a second. Some kind of things have to happen in 100th of a second. So for example, I'm seeing a virtual creature here and I move my head, I'd better be able to sort of see an update in 100th of a second, because if it takes 1/10 of a second, 100 milliseconds, I'm going to start feeling woozy from things floating around. So there are a whole bunch of interesting research projects for people to do about how do I use some sort of very efficient protocol, like coming, you know, 5G networks, which for limited data packets will guarantee a 10 millisecond hop time, which is enough to support visually, I move my head and stuff's floating around. And then there's some edge device here, which is going to have relatively modest graphics, kind of like what's on your phone, and it's going to have little cameras and little IMU, and it's going to use SLAM processing to kind of just figure out where things are. But it's not going to be able to do much more than that. If you hold your hand in front of you, it'll be able to find the edges of your hand in real time and say, okay, I can do that. But to understand some complicated gesture, it's going to eventually have to go up, maybe hop to the PC in your office when you're near that, or maybe go up to the cloud. And all of these protocols for what needs to happen in 100th of a second, 1/10 of a second, 1 second, 10 seconds, how to build all of these different levels of semantics, this is a real challenge that is going to consume a lot of people in the course of the next 5 to 10 years as the wearables start coming in. And the wearables are starting to come in. Now, this is an old picture now. This is from summer of 2017. This was from a group at Microsoft Research, and you can see it's an early prototype because it's obviously 3D printed. And you can see that that there is a little laser projector here, and here these are little holographic optical elements. And now these things are starting to, this fundamental idea is starting to show up in consumer items. Intel had a prototype. North Focals has a pair of glasses where I have a tiny little projector here and a holographic optical element, and you see something floating in front of you. And so these things are gradually entering the marketplace. And just over the course of the next 2 years, I think that transition is going to be complete. And even the thing that the people from Microsoft Research did almost 2 years ago, this is the kind of quality they could get. This is a very wide-angle view, and here this is a close-up of these tiny little text things. And you can see they could do full color. They do not block your vision, which is important. You're still seeing the world around you. You can see 3D objects in full color, and these are just actual images taken through these things. And so things that Vernor Vinge was talking about being 40 years in the future, if you just back up and you say, instead of contact lenses, let's make them lightweight glasses, they're happening. This is a real thing. I have one of these. This is the Bose frames. And I wear it all the time when I'm in New York, and I put my prescription in it so I can walk around. And it is an actual perfectly ordinary, wonderfully functional pair of glasses. But right here, if you see this piece right here, this has there's an IMU in here, so it's got a gyroscope and an accelerometer. It talks to your phone, and it's got a microphone built into it. And this little element here and here beams coherent sound right into the pinna of your ear. So when you put this thing on, I hear gorgeous all around me stereo sound. Just beautiful, but a person standing right there hears nothing. So this is a personal listening device, which, like those glasses, doesn't, and the reason I never used to listen to music when I walked around. And I realized, I used to think, oh, I just don't listen like this music. And the reason I realize now that I bought these, that I never liked listening to music, was I didn't like walking around New York City with something covering my ears. It just didn't seem like a good idea to be in a major city and not hear things. So, but now, no problem. I'm walking down the street, I'm listening to my music, and I hear everything, and I'm still engaged with the world. And here's something a little subtle and profound that is, this is probably a good place to say it because a number of the people here are going to be engaged in these questions. This idea that, you know, we all know about Google Glass, and we all know that at least for consumers, it failed, although it actually succeeds in enterprise applications. People use it in warehouses and factories, and so, but as a social thing out in the world, it hasn't succeeded. I was, I think, the first person in New York to try the North Focals. You know, I went to their try them on. I was like, maybe I'm going to buy them. And they look like a pair of glasses, but again, they have the little tiny projector, and they project something here. And what I learned very quickly was there was this nice young woman who tried them on me, and it was, you know, really, really pretty. How many people have heard of the North Focals? I'm just curious. Very few people have heard of them. They just look like a pair of glasses, except they have a little speaker, a little microphone, so you can actually do speech to text, but you're seeing a little floating little image right here in your right eye. So as you walk around, you have an app on your phone that shows, oh, and I say something and I see the speech to text, and I can call up Google Maps, and I can say, where is there a coffee shop nearby? And it shows me, it gives me directions and all kinds of things, and, you know, Siri, tell me a bad joke, and things like that. But I realized this woman was standing there in front of me, like about this far away. And she was saying, hey, now try this, try the maps. And I realized there's no way I can buy this thing. There's no way I can buy this thing because I will be dead within a week. And the reason is, if you are walking around in New York City and you're one of these clueless, stupid people, and you're looking, oh, the restaurant and Google Maps, I turn left here, okay, you know, the car sees you socially signaling that you're being an idiot. and they won't run you over. But I learned that if you've got this thing floating in front of you, you can't pay attention to everything else. You can't look at this and also notice this at the same time. I tried it. I couldn't pay attention to the woman right in front of me. And then I talked to some of my cognitive science friends, colleagues at NYU who study these things. And I said, oh, of course, it's well known that the visual field, unlike the sound field, we really don't have the brain processing to be able to focus our attention on two things at once. It's just not the way our brains are wired. It turned out not to be useful for evolution, so we can't do it. Which means if you're focused on something here, you're not seeing the world around you. Which means that the way people are doing it, which is coming out in the next 2 years, is essential. You have to use the little cameras, inside-out tracking, pick up dots with SLAM algorithms, IMUs, and basically put the augmented stuff in the physical world so that it looks like it's in the world, it's on the walls, it's floating between you, it's an object, because you have to keep people's attention in the physical world around them. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to be a fail. But fortunately, we know this is coming. We know how to do it, and people are working on it. And I suspect that between them, all the big companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, everyone is collectively spent, Huawei, Samsung, everyone is collectively spending billions of dollars to be the ones to be first to market on those things. And when somebody succeeds, that means that, like, this is obviously fake. I picked this one to be clearly fake. There's no shadows, it's bad lighting. But if Henry and I are walking down the street and he sees this from his perspective and I see it from my perspective and it's perfectly steady, and as we walk around, it's there, as far as we're concerned, that's part of the physical world. I mean, after all, we could get into philosophical debates about whether this projection is really part of this room. Well, it's really technologically enabled and we have a projector there and it's not real. But we just accept that it's in this room, because why should we be belaboring? Someone sends me a text. Was that really a person who sent me a text, or was that an electronic recreation of the person's thoughts? It's like, we don't think about stuff. It's just my friend sent me a text. And so I think at the point where these objects are just there, because we get the technology right, they will just be part of the built world, just like these lights are part of the built world, even though these lights are kind of just really information. The lights are not, the photons aren't physically there, they're being manifested, which means that we hold out our hand, we see some creature, it looks at us, and we'll just be like, yeah, that creature's there, just as much as my little toy dinosaurs were there. And when that creature moves and it turns and it looks at me, I accept it, because it'll be normal reality. And so I think that the interesting thing that we're getting at here is that we're starting to redefine the idea of normal reality to be whatever everybody agrees is kind of, this is the way stuff works, given the current level of technology. So one thing that it's both happy and sad, as I realized at some point, the way I described it to myself is that, you see some cool science fiction-y thing and you're like, wow, that's incredible, we can do that. And then like the next day you come back and you just stop looking at it because it's part of everyday life. So the way I think of it is basically the future always lasts for about 5 minutes. And after the first 5 minutes, it's not the future anymore. And then you have to find some other bright, shiny toy because, oh, we have plumbing, that's nice. How convenient for us. But this means that there are things we can't even imagine yet that people will do. I mean, the most important innovation in some sense wasn't really the iPhone itself. It was really when Apple finally realized what it needed to do shortly after that, is have an app store and let other people, let the vast number of entrepreneurial minds start figuring out, what do you use a smartphone for? It was really the introduction of the App Store and the thousands of apps, most of which are horrible, but some of which are really, really useful, and getting the collective thinking around what do you do with a smartphone that opened up the world to possibilities of what does it mean to have an edge computer in every pocket of every person that you meet. Just as it was really the openness of HTML and the fact that anybody could think about what they wanted to do and not wait for permission that made the web explode and made things like Wikipedia and Facebook and all these things possible. So these two people are looking at each other, and if they're wearing those glasses that are coming probably by 2021 at this point. It's just not, you know, there's no technological limitations anymore. It might be that initially they're going to have a wire that goes to your phone at first, you know, it'll be a peripheral, but kids will use it as long as it's actually more interesting for them. And what's going on between these two people? What's floating in the air that they are just thinking as part of their reality? Well, we can't know because the App Store doesn't exist yet. So one of the things we've started doing in our research lab is writing everything that we write in such a way, all our little bits of JavaScript, all of our graphics, in such a way that we wouldn't have to change a single line of code to have them just run floating in the air between people. So they can run, you know, in these programs like the one I'm using now where I do the glasses that you just saw, which is called ChalkTalk. Our stuff they run on the web as illustrations, but also we want to make sure that if you write a simulation of a molecule, or you write make a four-dimensional hypercube, or you make a musical notation tool, or a visualization of history, or anything, that code should be able to live here without having to change that code. You just change the libraries. And this is going to become incredibly important in the coming few years because we're going to want to see what floats. So to me, if we put on our glasses and it ends up being like Times Square, that's bad. There are people who are very, very wealthy, who are very powerful, who would want nothing more than to just take over your eyeballs and sell you stuff all the time. And this is what they want to do. So a number of people here know Jaron Lanier. He's a wonderful pioneer in virtual reality and other things. And he said to me at some point, you know, he was asked by both Google and Facebook whether they would want him to work with them. And he said, you know, he likes the people there. They're really nice people and they mean really well. But he said the problem is that their very existential business model is to be evil. They have no choice because the way they make their money is by selling your data to advertisers. So whatever they want to do, unless they fundamentally change how they make money, this is what they're doing. They're data scraping everybody with or without their consent any way they can and making money by selling it to people who want to sell you stuff. So this idea that, you know, in my own mind, I just have this image, in my own mind, the idea that you are Google's customer or that you are Facebook's customer, that sort of quaint notion, it's kind of like to me, it's like if you have a cartoon of two chickens in a chicken yard, and one chicken is saying to the other, yeah, and all the food here is free. So that's us, you know. You are not the customer, you're the product. And so that's the problem, is that once this is possible, there are so many issues, and I think we'll probably come to some of them during the Q&A. There are issues of privacy, there are issues of authentication, there are issues of, you know, oh, this is free, so we're going to advertise in front of you and everything is going to become Times Square. There's some really difficult challenges that we're going to have to deal with. And I think I want to circle back to that because I think the Q&A is probably the right place to talk about a lot of these ethical issues. One thing I do want to note is that if I were giving a talk 50 years ago, if I were giving a talk in 1969, and I was looking out a group of young people, and, you know, Star Trek is only 3 years old, you know, first time William Shatner, talked to the ship was 1966. And it's like, oh, that's cool. And I said, hey, you can have that. Everybody can have that. Really? That's so cool, man. That's great, you know? And everybody would be very excited when I tell them that this is coming and everyone's going to have one, and you'll be able to see maps everywhere, and you'll be able to buy stuff, and you'll be able to know where you are and talk to your friends, and they get more and more excited, and they say, oh yeah, there's just one thing that as you walk around, governments and big corporations know absolutely everywhere you are and everything you've ever done. Oh, be cool? And they would all be like, yeah, what are you smoking? You know, like, no way, no way. But now, you know, pretty much everyone here kind of makes that deal. You know, it's a very weird thing. Like now you have an entire generation that just de facto says, well, it's so convenient. And And even if you're not getting any service, even if you're not paying for anything, you're in some foreign country somewhere, it doesn't matter. Your phone knows exactly where you are. Your map still shows your location because your GPS is still running. So it's a very weird world we're going into, and it's going to get more intense when it's the wearables, because then they're going to know where you're looking and who you're looking at. And that just think about the implications of that. So there's some dark possibilities, but there are also bright possibilities. I mean, I love the idea that if I want to play with my little dinosaurs, like all I need to do in the future is, I draw a picture of a dinosaur, and because I drew it, it comes to life and it's on my table and it walks around and it exists in my world, and maybe it eats my plants, So this notion that I can just do anything I want is very powerful. And so you have these two powerful things going on, this sort of dark negative possibility that you're being tracked all the time, and this possibility that you can be basically Harry Potter meets Harold and the Purple Crayon. You can be totally empowered to have a creative world, that you collaborate with people. All this ability that we have to use our eyes and our face and our voice and our hands is suddenly going to really be enhanced and supported by computers in a way that they never were. This is a poor substitute for this. There's almost no comparison in terms of the richness of it. I made a little concept video not that long ago, actually about a year and a half ago, in which I basically just pointed a video camera at myself and I did a real-time I let the camera run and I captured the screen, did a real-time presentation of what, imagine my computer graphics tutoring lecture might be like if we just simply had the glasses and we could just do this. So I think we want the lights a little dim for this, because I think the video is a little dim. So let's see, where is it? I guess it'd be here. So this is all just real time. This is just me talking in front of my computer, in front of this computer, in fact.
If I want to teach you a concept from physics, such as the movement of a pendulum, I should just be able to draw the pendulum in the air between us. I should also be able to draw a graph which shows what happens when I apply an impetus to the bob of the pendulum, and then you can see the roughly sinusoidal wave which ensues as a result. If I want to teach you about an animated character, I should be able to draw a very fat character, or I should be able to draw the same character as very skinny. And you should be able to see, based on this, how the character movement is affected by its shape. If I want to teach you about three-dimensional rotation, I should be able to draw an object and apply various properties to that object, for example, color, and then drop that object into a coordinate system, which could either be a two-dimensional coordinate system or it could be a three-dimensional coordinate system. If we drop the object into the coordinate system, you can see that any changes to the object itself are reflected in the view of the object in the coordinate system. To do something a little more sophisticated, we need more sophisticated tools. For example, a 4x4 matrix, which can be used to affect translation or rotation. Now, this is just a symbolic matrix, but if instead I make a numeric matrix by, for example, attaching a slider to it, then I should...
Sorry about the internet speed.
...be able to change numeric values in ranges, in this case, from 0 to 1 radian, or in this case, from 0 to 10 radians. Applying this matrix to the relationship between the polygon and the coordinate system, I should be able to now see how, by interposing the matrix, I'm able to change the rotation about, for example, the x-axis, or perhaps the y-axis. Notice that this is a slightly different matrix. Or I should be able to add time as a quality in this relationship by dragging time between the slider and the matrix itself. Now this becomes a rate controller. And I can, for example, rotate more quickly about the y-axis, or I could alternatively rotate about the z-axis. Now, everything I'm doing is actually three-dimensional. You can see that I'm actually rotating in 3 dimensions, and this is actually a scene that's floating in space between you and me. Now let's talk about dimensions. We can have 3-dimensional objects, but we could also have 4-dimensional objects. Here, for example, is a hypercube. Now, a hypercube, when projected down to 3 dimensions, appears to be the same as a cube, but if we rotate it about the right axis, we can see it's actually a 4-dimensional object that can appear through augmented reality to be floating in the air between us. Thank you.
Yay. Okay. All right. So that was fun. And just so you know, everything that I was doing there is actually, this ChalkTalk program is actually just a program. I use this for all my teaching. It really everything I draw just comes to life. And I can just, if I wanted to draw a hypercube and just, and I could also, I can do things like bring up the code and let people see like how it's implemented. So, if you want to make changes to your hypercube, I don't know, crazy stuff, it'll just go ahead and do that. So, so this is, this paradigm that we always give people this sort of way of expressing themselves gesturally, and then we try to figure out where does that lead us, because we're trying to get ready for that future, which will come very soon, much sooner than you think. It's kind of like 1991 thinking about the web, or 2005 thinking about the smartphone. We have to think about it now, because I do not want a future where it's all about us being passive recipients of somebody advertising toward us. I want it to be something where it becomes more like the flowering that happened in the early days of the web, where it's like, oh, hey, we can make stuff and we can start communicating, we can start forming our own social groups and not just be plugged in to buy stuff. And so this is a book which greatly influenced me, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which actually is, I think it's from, now it's a quarter of a century old. Very influential book. I recommend it. How many people have read The Language Instinct? Just curious. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. One person did this, yes, which is language, by the way. And so what's interesting about it is he basically he pulls together the research of many evolutionary linguists, where they show this very compelling evidence that language, the ability to learn language, is a universal trait that's kind of built into our genetic inheritance. We're very good at being able to be thrown into a society where there is language when we're a little child, and then pick that up, and then not only that, and this is important, not only that, but language, empirically it's been shown that language is not actually evolved by grown-ups. Language is pretty much exclusively evolved by little children from 7 or 8 years old and under. And it's, when you think about it even a little bit, it's logical, because basically natural language must be something, by definition, that's naturally learnable. It must be something that children don't have to go to school to learn, but rather they pick up instinctively when they're exposed to it in everyday life. And the only human minds that actually understand instinctively what that is the minds of little children, which are actually biologically different from the minds of grown-ups. They have structures that we don't have. There are structures that sort of go away and others evolve. There's this transition somewhere around 7 or 8 years old where you lose this astonishing ability to just soak up languages and have this free associative way of thinking, and you evolve what's called your adult mind, where you start thinking logically and in sequences and task planning, et cetera. And it's a profound transition. And so it seems to me that if we really want the full power of everything we're talking about, we need to figure out how to take some of these ideas of speech enhanced by gesture and objects in the air, and we need to understand how they could be incorporated as acts of natural language. So children will just start being able to communicate in richer and more powerful ways. Maybe children will be able to to understand 4 dimensions in intuitive ways that we can't, because their toys that they grow up with are 4-dimensional toys, like a 4-dimensional Rubik's Cube or whatever. It's like, oh, I'm playing with this, and now I go off as an engineer or as an architect or as a biologist, and my colleagues and I, 20, 25 years from now, we're just building 4-dimensional models because every little kid played with that toy. So we become a little bit sort of like, you know, Moses in the promised land. He doesn't get to go, but he gets to kind of send off the next generation. And I think that really is the best we can do. The best we can do is figure out how to steer this long-term vector of capability so that it's not about us, it's not about our products, it's not about the stuff that we buy. It's really about creating, just as written language itself, which I think is still the most important technological advancement, because written language itself, over the course of several thousand years ago, enabled any one individual human mind to transmit their ideas to all of humanity through all of history in the future, centuries and centuries down the line. And then things like the web and things like this universal connectivity and things like cinema, which allowed us to share emotion across lifespans. I think we're at the cusp of the next one. And I think the most important thing is to think of the next one, not in terms of, oh, I can make money by selling stuff. That's the wrong direction. But by thinking of that your real customers are the minds of these people. And how are they going to use this if we make all the right decisions to create a better future reality? Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Again, I've seldomly heard a talk where I was so concentrated on what you say over every minute. I couldn't even make a thought away from that. So it was so fascinating. Now, I'm sure there are many questions coming up with this, but I have one that I want to start with.
Okay.
And that is, you propose that we get all these creative possibilities that enhance, that enrich our life. But at the same time, that doesn't answer the question about who knows what we're doing and what happens with all these data. And as we can see from like countries like China, where Google is like abandoned, this does give the system, if I call the whole thing the system, the opportunity to allow me certain things or not, which means it actively can influence the lines of creativity that I'm able to take in the first place. Don't you see that, or don't you believe that there is a high danger there that we could be manipulated in an even deeper way than we are now just by getting advertisements?
Oh, absolutely. The danger is much, much greater. You know, right now I can pick up my New York Times and I read some article about something and I think, oh, well, these people who read the Times, they're liberals like me. They're opposed to the Trump administration. They're aligned with me. And so everything I read, I was like, yeah, that's right. But then sometimes even people who politically agree with me, I look things up and like, no, actually, they're kind of full of it. You know, what they're saying is just a political agenda. So we form these tribes and we form these self-identification, oh, those people are like me, I trust them. And I know that people, not just advertisers, but people with other agendas are going to use this in very powerful ways. Like you'll walk around and someone will label, oh, that's a person who's your enemy. Or, you know, don't do that. Or in a country like China, it gets really bad because we know you're still looking at that person even though we said that they're your enemy. So you lose social merit points and you're not going to get a promotion. So there's some really, really dark stuff that can be possible. And also one's ability to fight against this sort of tribal connection, like, oh, the Times said it, it must be true because they're on my side. It's easier to do that when you read it. It's hard to do that when it starts being labeled in the world around you and you have this visceral reaction to the things and the people around you, you being told constantly how you're supposed to classify them. And the easiest thing to do is going to be lazy and say, oh, someone is telling me what's right. Well, I don't have to worry about that. So the bar is going to be higher to be a discerning, responsible adult. So that said, because it's very dangerous, and the problem is we can't ban this stuff. This is going to come out. All we can do is steer it. So I think that there was a guy named Kranzberg who had Kranzberg's 10 laws of technology. He's passed away now, unfortunately, but his first law of technology stated that technology is not good and is not bad and is not neutral. And which is a very profound statement, because basically it is entirely up to us as responsible citizens to decide what society we want. Technology cannot provide the solution. And I think there's a very simple analogy that I can use to kind of get that point home. Right now, every one of you probably every one of you has an abode, an apartment or a house with a lock on the door. Maybe one if you leave your doors unlocked, but almost everybody locks the door. And yet every one of you knows that it's technologically very easy for someone to defeat your lock and break in and steal your stuff. But you're not running home because you're afraid someone's going to steal your stuff. Why? The reason is that you're not relying on the technology of the lock. The lock is kind of a social indicator that says, in order to break into this house, you have to break into this house. I do not invite you in. And then we rely on social strictures, on a law enforcement agency, on a whole system to sort of say, the cost benefit of somebody breaking into my house is too high, so leave me alone. But we're not relying on technology. Technology is one piece of it. But we're not saying, oh, good, I have technology, I have unbreakable locks, I'm done. Instead, we rely on lots and lots of other stuff that we've built up, because if we live in a society that believes in private property, then we have a whole bunch of social, cultural, and legal stuff. So if we believe in a fundamental right to not be spied on, there is no technological solution that's going to be secure. We have to say, I want going beyond this line to be illegal in this society, and we have to have the will of an informed populace that makes that happen. So there's no easy solution to the dark side of this stuff.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions, other comments? Yeah.
I have just a comment.
Maybe the microphone. Yeah, okay.
It has nothing to do with computer graphics.
Okay.
You mentioned the whole thing is what will win out is something that connects people, not the isolation. But how do we deal with that in a society that goes more in the direction of changing everything to a more isolating thing? Think of the structure in a bank. All the machines in the front of the bank, you don't get to talk to the teller anymore. The e-card or any of these things, they're more, I always find it as really pushing people towards isolation, and communication is losing out here.
Well, I agree with you. I think that certain structures like banks are basically in transition from being actual physical brick and mortar places where, you know, those of us who have been around for a while, we sort of think of that, we thought of them as community places. Oh, I talked to the person. And I think they're in the process, that physical thing is in the process of going away. And what we're seeing is the fading away of that. And other things, though, will continue to exist. And I think that it's sort of like every time, oh, what's going to happen? You know, this fundamental technology is going away. You know, the coal or steam engines or things that people used to think of as so fundamental that you couldn't imagine them. And then they just gradually are replaced by other things. But you're watching something dying, and that's what happens. And people connecting with each other will spring up somewhere else because people want to connect with them. They'll find other ways of gathering in their community.
Stimulating. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
I'll face this way so people can see. I think this is really a fundamental question, observation that you just made, that while some things are in transition and are going away, like physical banks, I went to one yesterday. By the way, my bank, there was one physical person there. Mm-hmm. That's really an interesting thing, you know? It's not 5, it's one person there. and some other things will spring up because I agree with you, we want to be together. So what I wonder is, what are your thoughts about what is bringing us together again? Because my feeling now is that we're in this transition in which through the internet and email and Skype and social messaging, we're closer to many people around the world than we are to our next door neighbor. So what do you see as the transition of coming together that is the opposite of the banks and others going away?
That's a really, really good question. By the way, can someone get me some water? I'm just a little dehydrated. Oh, great. I didn't even know that was behind me. Thank you. I got it. See, the benefits of the physical world. So I think that, first of all, this is a transitional early stage technology. Looking into this little tiny screen was the only way that anyone knew how to get you access to being able to communicate with people who are not physically present. But once you move past that, and this becomes this like quaint little artifact from those old days, 2019, remember that? And we move on to things that are more visually present. I think we're going to go into a richer phase where there's a very large amount of firepower in our brain that's about eye contact and body movement and facial expressions and gestures, and we're not using that stuff at all when we're communicating with people in these things. And maybe we use modulation of our voice. You see people smiling when they're talking on the phone, and the other person can hear the change in their voice from the resonance of their voice when they smile. And so they kind of know this person is talking while smiling. But that's a poor substitute for somebody's really smiling or there's a twinkle in their eye. So I think that both for in-person communication and for communication that's not in person, for both of these things, because I actually divide everything into reality and the telephone. Reality is when someone's in the same room as you. The telephone is when they're not in the same room with you. And email is the telephone, and Skype is the telephone, and VR chats with people in California is the telephone. But anyone who is in the same room with you, that's reality. And I think it's going to continue to be the case always that we will value reality over the telephone. No matter how either of them evolve, because this is where we live. This is where our loved ones are. This is where our spouses, where our children, this is where we eat our meals. This is where all of our really fundamental bonding rituals happen, is in person. So I don't think that we are going into a society where in-person connection is being replaced by by evolutions of the telephone. But given that, I do think that the worst thing you can do to a person is to lock them up and isolate them from other people. It's like the most painful punishment you give someone is deny them other people's company. And so I think that our fundamental human need to want to hang out with each other, to use that part of our theory of mind, to understand each other and keep developing that, is going to drive everything in the long run as technology allows it. So people will try to subvert that, basically the informational equivalent of replacing food with opioids. But I think we should be fighting that, and we should be, but I think that we may prevail because our instincts are aligned properly. And that's why I think there's a positive answer to your question.
I'm not sure if this is going to work. I mean, remember the studies which show that people on social media get depressed and unhappy because all the others post pictures of how happy and perfect their lives are. And now think of the next step of the consensual hallucination, as William Gibson said, of presentation on the outside. You see, even when you meet these people, you see them as happy and with additional augmentations and whatever. And could this lead to a society where each and every person is isolated and unhappy, but projects a virtual image of being happy and being in a perfect relationship and whatever perfect makeup all the time.
Well, maybe in a positive scenario, technology will develop so far that I will be able to see through these thin disguises, and I will be able to see how incredibly unhappy and miserable everybody else is,
Yep.
and then I will feel wonderful.
But tell this to the makeup industry.
I don't know.
I'm more of a pessimist. You're optimist. Thanks.
So hi, great and visionary talk, and thank you. I'm not so sure I'm so convinced that people always like to stay more in reality if they are in the same room with people. I just have to think about my daughter.
But your daughter's also hanging out with her friends.
Yeah, but they are hanging out with their friends, looking at their smartphone
but I think
together.
the draw there is still hanging out with her peer group. You know, so in other words, what's pulling her into this stupid little box is the minds of people that she engages with because she's socially connected with them as peers. So I'm just pointing out that it's not as simple as this person is checking out. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is a technological question. So your vision kind of involves that everybody has to wear some kind of device on his head. I mean, now most people do actually have some sort of glasses, but not all of them.
Well, but also just at that point, it's just worth pointing out that half the people here, more or less, are wearing glasses.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you don't look to the left or right, you have no idea which people are wearing glasses, and that's important because that means glasses have become socially invisible. They involve basically zero social signaling, and that's an example of a successful technology. So as a baseline, it's not so bad.
Yeah, that's true. But if I weren't short-sighted, then I wouldn't be like to wear glasses all the time. And I don't know whether that's true for everybody, but are you sure that that kind of 100% of people would just put on glasses to be able to use this technology?
I don't know. Do 100% of people want to wear something like this in their pocket? I don't know. Let's see. We'll have to see what happens. I do know I don't wear glasses. I see just fine. I noticed that when I got my Bose frames, I was walking around wearing them all the time with no corrective lenses because this is awesome. You know, so that's me, but I don't know what everyone's going to do. I suspect that what people do is whatever allows them to connect with their peers in the most powerful way, and then that just becomes normal for them, whatever it is. And whether this is it, I guess we'll have to find out.
Hello. You gave a very positive, cheerful, motivating talk, and everyone's just voicing their worries and being devil's advocate. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be one more. When we see this future, one thing that keeps popping into my mind is right now we have sort of a trust crisis in some media. Like you can see this with fake news. And there's so much information that is really hard to pinpoint reality. Someone that has been following, for instance, the politics in Brazil, you can see that everyone's living in a sort of abstract space, and it's really hard to keep it straight. And you just said that having these rich experiences can put you into a much more visceral, let's say, cognitive mode. So how would you say that this is going to happen if we move into this next step before solving this trust crisis, like before understanding how we can trust the media, how we can trust that everything is fake news or not? If we don't solve this before and these devices start becoming more and more common, how do you feel like people...
See, I think that you might be giving too much credit to what I'm saying. Fake news existed for thousands of years, and fake news exists with every technology we've ever devised. As Hamlet said, not in the stars, but ourselves. And I think Kranzberger's right. It's up to us. This technology is not going to solve these problems. It's going to allow us to be more human, to do what we do as humans, as an amplifier for our humanness, as communicators, as tribal beings, as tool makers. But it's really up to us. The reason I'm giving this talk now is not to tell people, hey, everything's going to be great. It's more to tell people this stuff is coming. If we care about this, we have to start figuring out, really smart minds have to start figuring out, how do we steer the conversation against, what happened in Brazil or the United States, where you get, that's interesting, that person's in power, how did we get there? How do we avoid things like that? I completely agree with you, but the technology is not the solution.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more question. You emphasize this social need of people. Now, what about artificial, virtual agents that enrichen my world, although there is no one else there, but they give me the feeling I am with others, like is often thought in the direction of elderly people who are alone and have some virtual assistants, robots, whatever. Can that be a replacement in your opinion?
There's strong empirical evidence. There actually have been scientific studies. There was a University of Vienna did a study where they basically started giving people chemicals that made them more prone to bonding with each other. Some of the chemicals that are, for example, found in mother's milk that bond mothers and children. And they found that when they put people in controlled circumstances interacting with each other, that people were more likely to make trusting choices when they were exposed to these chemicals. But then they repeated the exact experiment, but they told people, oh, that's an AI. And it made the chemical had no difference. So I think that zero difference statistically. So knowing that someone is a real human being is a very, very powerful thing for us. We care about that. It's baked into our brain on a biological, chemical level. And again, there's strong empirical evidence for this, which means that I think that, sure, as a convenience, yes, here's my little pet cyber dog, and this feels good and everything, but I think people will be profoundly resistant to the idea that they're being lied to about this, and they will really care. And that if you give them an artificial thing, that, oh, that's an artificial thing, I'll just switch it off. Like completely different reactions. They'll think of it the way they think of a very beloved toy, but that's not the way that sane people think about other humans. And that's us, that's not technology.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have one more question back there. Yeah, wait for the microphone, please.
Okay, I take the chance.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I'm here.
Yeah.
It's not looking.
Do you want to start, or because I wanted just to say something to this part, because you said for like children growing up, they are growing up with different values, with different natural communication. Why would they not grow up with a different way about thinking about artificial intelligence? Because this is like older people which are growing up with value that a human is something very different. So I'm just curious about the...
Well, I think that one could and should repeat the university of study that I cited with little children. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing that you're sort of suggesting, and see whether there have been societal shifts in the intervening years. That's a great idea.
Okay,
you should be doing that. Yeah.
Okay, hi. I try to think about the bright side of the future. Today I need some control of media channel, or at least have to run a website to distribute information. If I can place information to the real space, adding augmentations, do you think that will democratize the possibility to place information into the world, to communicate?
Well, I think that the word democratize is a loaded word. Yeah. I think that the ability to do something physically does not get rid of the need for people to go through the work of education. So yes, there are things that will then become available to people so they will have access to tools to then become, but just because I have access to a guitar doesn't make me a great guitarist. So I don't think access is wonderful. I think there are probably more really interesting filmmakers today because of YouTube, because someone could just have a greater number of people. There are also horrible things on YouTube that are terrible by very untalented people. I know, I've seen some of them. But the greater opportunity creates greater opportunity. But so democratization is a two-edged sword, and we have to make sure that we understand people have to put work in, even with access to tools.
Okay, so I think it's time for the coffee break now. Thank you very much again, Ken, for this very inspiring talk.
Oh, you're welcome.